I told you I was going to ask you this question.
Uh-oh.
And I'll give you a preface.
Okay.
I grew up hearing and believing for most of my life that the miraculous gifts are no longer for today. And then through study and D.A. Carson's book on 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, other things as well, Wayne Grudem's book on prophecy, I began to rethink that. So I would no longer say that I don't think miraculous gifts could be for today. That's as far as it's gone. So I asked you earlier, is it woefully inconsistent for a church like ours that has a leadership that probably agrees with me on that? Our whole leadership would be what's called continuationist, not cessationist. The gifts continue instead of have ceased. Are we inconsistent that it stopped there and there's really no overt pursuit or maybe even interest in practicing the gifts? Rebuke away.
Oh, dear. There are varieties of continuationism, as I mentioned to you when we were talking about it. There are those who will say, I'm a continuationist in the sense that I don't believe the New Testament explicitly teaches that all such gifts of the Spirit died when the apostles did. But they remain skeptical about whether those gifts are actually operative in our day. In other words, they would say, the Bible doesn't teach that God caused them to cease, but I don't necessarily believe that He's still giving them. There are continuationists who will say, I believe that the New Testament not only doesn't teach that they've ceased, I think it explicitly teaches that they are designed to continue throughout the whole course of church history. But for whatever reason, they have chosen not to explore that more deeply. I'm a continuationist I'm a practicing continuationist. I'm not just a theoretical or theological continuationist. I'm a practicing one. And our church is. I would just simply say to anybody who believes that the New Testament actually teaches that the gifts of the Spirit, all of them, are the tools that God has bestowed upon His people for the purpose of building the church and the kingdom. And that you believe in your heart not only that God didn't cause them to cease and that He could bestow them today, but that in fact He does. For you not then to actively pursue and pray for and facilitate their expression constitutes sin. Because I believe 1 Corinthians 14:1, earnestly desire spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy, is not optional. It's a command. I don't see anything in the New Testament that would lead me to believe that that was intended exclusively for the church at Corinth or exclusively for the church in the first century. It seems to me that Paul is speaking by the inspiration of the Spirit to instruct the global church until Jesus comes back. So my exhortation, it's not a rebuke, it's an exhortation, is if you are not earnestly desiring spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy, you're sinning. Don't get mad at me. I didn't write the verse. Paul did. So the only way you can come back at that and push back is you've got to make a very strong case that was somehow uniquely restricted to the first century, and I don't think the case can be made. So I would simply say, if you really sincerely embrace a continuationist theology, you need to go before the Lord. You need to begin to pray. You need to begin to ask yourself, what are we doing to hinder the expression of spiritual gifts? What are we afraid of? John Piper used this incredible imagery. He said it frustrates him that preachers will get up and preach about the legitimacy of gifts for today and then follow it up with what he called this verbalized institutionalization of caution. In other words, oh yes, spiritual gifts for today. There's no evidence that they ceased in the first century. Oh, but beware. And then go into long homiletical tirades about fanaticism and extremism. Granted, fanaticism and extremism exist and you ought to avoid it. But you do it in such a way that you terrify people. And you put chains on their hearts and their minds and their spirits, and you make them fearful that if they should ever explore, if they should ever step out in faith, if they should ever pay attention to what they might sense as the voice of God, that if they should ever want to pray for the sick, that they're somehow going to be rebuked by leadership or marginalized in the church. So pray, seek the heart of God, read the scriptures, read good books on the subject. Train small group leaders in how to facilitate this in those gatherings, because I don't believe that large corporate settings that can fill this many seats is the proper place for it to occur. It just doesn't work that well. And be willing to look like a fool. I don't take vows. I don't believe in making vows because I always break them. But I have made one vow to God that by His grace to this day I have never broken. And it came in about 88, 89, when I had made this theological shift. And I can still remember it. I was sitting at home and I was watching television. It was one of the religious stations. And if I mentioned the man's name, you'd know who it was. And he was praying for the sick and prophesying. And I wanted to deck him. It was horrible. It was offensive. It was manipulative. It was abusive. It was irreverent toward God. It was unfair to people. It was and I sat there and I felt myself. I could feel it physically, just constricting inside, and I felt myself recoiling. And it's like I was saying, boy, if that's what it means to walk in the power of the Spirit, I don't want anything to do with it. And then I stopped. I said, wait a minute, Sam. Hold on, buddy. Why would you allow the error, immaturity, and abuses of a man like that, or even many men like that, to dictate whether or not you're going to obey the Bible? And I realized that most evangelicals are diligent to observe the 11th commandment. Thou shalt not do at all what others do poorly. We're really good at obeying that. So I said, Lord, with your help and your grace, I commit to you this day, I will never again justify my disobedience to your word by appealing to the abuse of others. And by God's grace, I think I've kept that. I will not allow, and folks, we all know who the fanatics and those who are a disgrace to the name of Christ. Turn on TV, you can see them regularly. I will not allow those people. I will not use them to justify my disobedience to what I think God's word is telling me to do. I just won't do it. And if that means looking like a fool, so be it.